To be able to give back and share my emotions with the world because I feel like it is so hard for a lot of people to do that. If I can share my experiences, it'll be easier for them to heal. Like properly done, it's just amazing. We've been all at the Raffles the Palm, which is beautiful.
This is the last episode. And before anything else gets said, I want you to understand something that most channels covering this story will never admit out loud. Everything you have been told about Darcey Silva, every hot take, every reaction video, every "she's done this time" headline, every comment section verdict has been a selected version of a complete person. Not a lie, a selection. And selections, however carefully made, leave things out. This series has spent 40 episodes getting as close to the full picture as documentation allows. And in this final episode, we are going to go further than documentation. We are going to talk about who she actually is. Not the brand, not the crisis, not the behavioral loop that became a meme. The person underneath all of it. The one the cameras never quite caught. And she is, without question, the most genuinely interesting subject this channel has ever covered. If you are new here, hit subscribe right now, because what you are about to hear is the kind of content that does not exist anywhere else in this space. And if you have been here since episode 1, this one is for you. Hit like. You earned this ending. Now, let's get into it. For 10 years, Darcey Silva has been one of the most watched, most mocked, most dissected women in reality television. She became a cultural shorthand. When people wanted to describe someone chasing love past the point of dignity, they said her name. When producers needed a storyline about romantic desperation and emotional volatility, they called her. When the internet needed a reaction gif of someone crying in an airport, hers was the face. She became, without fully choosing it and without fully resisting it, a symbol. And symbols are useful. They are also, almost universally, unfair to the people they are built out of. Here is what the symbol version of Darcey Silva always missed. The woman is smart. Not in a buried, tragic, you'd never know it way. Genuinely, observably, demonstrably intelligent in the specific mode of someone who understands people, understands rooms, understands what an audience wants before the audience has fully articulated it to themselves. Every single producer who has worked with her closely, the ones who went on record, the ones who did not, the ones who chose careful language, and the ones who did not bother, every single one of them, said the same thing when pressed past the official narrative. She is the most instinctively gifted television subject they have worked with. Not the most polished, not the most controlled, the most gifted. There is a difference. And it matters. And it is the difference that the format could never properly contain. Reality television does not know what to do with intelligence that comes packaged in vulnerability. The genre is built on a specific transaction. You expose your life, we give you a platform. The audience provides the attention, and the edit decides the meaning. That transaction works efficiently when the subject does not fully see what is happening to them. When the subject sees it, when they understand the edit, anticipate the production choice, feel the shape of the narrative being constructed around their actual life, it creates a tension that the format has no mechanism to resolve. You can see that tension in almost every frame of Darcey Silva's decade on television. The awareness in her eyes when the scene requires performed unawareness. The intelligence operating just below the surface of every exchange that the producers needed to read as naivety. She knew. She almost always knew. And she chose, for reasons this series has spent 40 episodes trying to fully understand, to keep going anyway. That choice, the ongoing choice to participate in a format that consistently minimized her, is the most misread thing about her. The critics called it desperation. The comment sections called it delusion. The armchair diagnoses called it something clinical and dismissive. What it actually was, what the evidence, assembled carefully and honestly, points toward, is a specific kind of calculated risk. She needed the platform. She understood the cost of the platform. She paid the cost while building, quietly and over years, the infrastructure that would eventually let her operate without needing to pay it anymore. That is not the behavior of someone who doesn't understand what is happening to them. That is the behavior of someone who understands exactly what is happening and has decided they can outlast it. And here is where the story gets genuinely interesting, because the question was always whether she could. Whether the cost of the platform would extract more than the platform could ultimately provide. Whether the patterns the production was reinforcing would compound past the point of sustainable management, whether the gap between the public version of her life and the private truth of it would eventually become unbridgeable. Those were the real stakes of 10 years of documented public life. Not the relationships, not the drama, not the will they won't they of any particular season. The real stakes were always, can a person survive the version of themselves that television creates and come out the other side as someone more complete than when they went in? The answer, after 40 episodes of the most comprehensive documentation this channel has assembled on a single subject, the answer is yes, conditionally, partially, with significant cost and ongoing complication, and the specific kind of progress that does not photograph well and does not generate viral moments, but is, when you look at it honestly and in full, unmistakably real. She is making it. She is becoming something. And what she is becoming is more interesting than anything the symbol version of her ever allowed the audience to see. Let's talk about the financial picture, because this is where the narrative gets its most significant twist, and because the financial reality of Darcey Silva's situation is both more complicated and more hopeful than either the defenders or the critics have accurately represented. The Chapter 7 filing was real. The debt was real. The financial decisions that generated the debt were real and documented, and, in several cases, genuinely difficult to defend from a purely strategic standpoint. This series has not minimized any of that, but the narrative that the filing represented a final collapse, that it was the end of the story, rather than a chapter in the middle of it, that narrative got the meaning wrong. Chapter 7 is a legal mechanism. It is designed to do a specific thing, discharge unsustainable debt, and create the conditions for a viable financial future. It is not a moral verdict. It is a financial tool, and the person who used it has, in the period following its use, made financial decisions that are structurally different from the ones that generated the crisis in the first place. The TLC relationship has been restructured. The terms are different. The dependency is different. The leverage that the production relationship had over her financial existence for a decade has been not eliminated, but meaningfully reduced. She has, in the last 18 months, built a revenue model that does not require any single relationship to be the entire foundation of her professional existence. That is not nothing. That is actually the most financially sophisticated thing she has done in 10 years of public life. The people covering her finances from the outside, the commentary channels, the comment section analysts, are still telling the story of the collapse. The actual current financial picture tells a different story. Smaller in some ways, genuinely more stable in the ways that matter for long-term sustainability. She traded scale for structure. And that trade, quietly made during the period everyone was narrating as her professional death, is starting to produce returns that the peak era numbers never would have generated in the same form. Now, here is the thing about Darcey Silva's professional trajectory that almost nobody in this space has accurately captured, and I want to say this carefully because it matters. The work she is doing now is better than the work that made her famous. Not better rated, not better distributed, not better optimized for the metrics that generate sponsorship conversations. Better in the sense of being more real, more considered, more genuinely connected to who she actually is, rather than who the format needed her to be. The new production relationship is generating content that the people who follow this space most closely describe as the most interesting creative work of her career. Not the most popular, most interesting. And interesting, in a media landscape built almost entirely on the deliberate manufacture of engagement, is genuinely rare. It is also, historically, what converts into longevity. The viral moments have a shelf life. The interesting work accumulates. She is accumulating. The book deserves a full conversation because the book is the most important thing happening in her professional life right now, and it has received the least proportionate coverage in the commentary space. This is partly because books generate less immediate content than social media controversies. It is partly because the people covering her do not fully understand what the book represents in terms of her professional trajectory. And it is partly because the book, based on what has been shared and reported about its contents, is genuinely difficult to frame with the kind of clean narrative that commentary channels require. It is not a redemption memoir in the traditional format. It is not an accountability confession. It is something more complicated and more interesting than either of those things. It is a first-person account of a decade of public life, written by someone who understands, with considerable sophistication, both the story that has been told about her and the distance between that story and the truth of her experience. The Chapter 7 content, the sections that deal directly with the most documented and most difficult periods of her life, is intact. The names are present. The account is specific. This is not someone who has decided to manage the narrative one more time. This is someone who has decided, at significant personal cost and with full awareness of the consequences, to tell the version that does not require management. That decision to write the real book instead of the safe one is the most significant professional choice she has made in 10 years. It is also the choice that will, when the book exists in the world and people can read it, change the shape of the conversation about her more fundamentally than any single episode of any production she has been part of. Let's talk about Stacey. Because the twin relationship is the thread that runs through the entire decade of this story, and it is also the thread that the coverage has most consistently gotten wrong. The Darcey and Stacey narrative, the public one, the TLC one, the one that the brand was built on, was always a specific version of a relationship that is, in reality, considerably more complex. The performance of twin closeness, the mirrored aesthetic, the shared brand identity, the professional infrastructure built on a kind of inseparability, all of that was real in terms of its commercial function. It was also a performance layer applied over a relationship that contained, underneath it, the same complicated individual needs and separate identities and specific resentments and genuine loves that any two people who have been bound together their entire lives inevitably develop. What happened in the 4-hour conversation? The real one. The unproduced one. The one that people who were in the hours after it have described with the specific kind of weight that attaches to things that are actually true. What happened in that conversation was a renegotiation of the entire relationship on terms that neither sister had been able to articulate while the cameras were on. Darcey said what she needed. Stacey heard it. And the thing Darcey said, she needed to be known as herself, specifically, not as the twin who comes first in the title, not as the brand partner, not as the more volatile half of a matched set. That thing is both the simplest and the most significant thing she has ever said in any documented or undocumented context this series has been able to access. To be known as yourself after 40 years of a shared identity, after a decade of a shared brand. After the kind of systematic conflation that happens when two people let a production company build a mythology around their relationship because the mythology was useful and the alternative was harder. To say to your sister, in a room with no audience, "I need you to know me as me." That is not a small thing. That is the thing that everything else in the story has been circling for 10 years. And Stacey's response, "I know her, I always did. I just didn't always know how to say it when the cameras were on," is the most important sentence in 40 episodes of this series. Because it means the knowledge was always there. The specific, individual recognition of the specific, individual person was always present underneath the performance. It was the performance that obscured it. And the performance is ending. Not the professional relationship that continues, productively, on terms that are more honest than the previous decade's version. The performance layer, the managed version of a relationship that was always more real, more complicated, and more genuinely loving than the brand required it to appear. There is a specific moment that this series needs to document before it ends, not because it is dramatic, not because it generated views or controversy or any of the metrics that the format uses to assign significance. Because it is true, and true things deserve to be documented even when they are quiet. The panel appearance, the one that the community covering this space noticed immediately as different qualitatively, undeniably different from anything she had done in a public context before. The people who were in the room described the same thing, a woman who was answering from somewhere the performance had never accessed. Not polished, not managed, not working from the version of herself that the decade of TLC had installed as the default public interface. Answering from somewhere further in, somewhere that the journalism, the long-form profile, the 3 days of actual access had apparently reached, and more importantly, that she had apparently decided was safe to show. The audience felt it. That is not a small thing in a media environment built almost entirely on the audience's highly calibrated ability to detect inauthenticity. The audience, which has spent a decade becoming experts at reading the difference between the Darcey Silva who is performing and the Darcey Silva who is present, felt the difference immediately. They showed up for it. Not in the numbers of the peak era, in the numbers of an audience that has self-selected for something real. And an audience that has self-selected for something real is the most valuable audience a public figure can build. It is not the most lucrative in the short term. It is the most sustainable in the long term. It is the audience that stays when the format changes and the platform shifts and the algorithm moves on to the next thing. It stays because it is not there for the format. It is there for the person. The journalist who spent 3 days in her actual life, not the produced version, not the carefully managed access, the actual life, wrote something that the people who have covered Darcey Silva for the past decade described as the piece they did not think was possible to write. Not because the access was unprecedented, though it was, because the subject was fully present for it, because the version of herself that showed up for 3 days of genuine journalism was the version that the previous decade of coverage had been producing evidence of without ever being able to directly document. The private intelligence, the specific emotional generosity, the humor that operates in a register, the production always edited around because it was too dry and too self-aware for the format that needed her performing rather than observing. The magazine cover and the headline about who she became, that is not a managed image rehabilitation. That is a document of a person who has decided to be documented accurately. Here is the hardest thing this series has to say, and it deserves to be said plainly, without irony, without the analytical distance that 40 episodes of documentation makes available as a kind of protective layer. The patterns that this series documented: the acceleration of romantic relationships, past sustainable velocity, the gap between aspiration and demonstrable reality, the insight cycle that produced recognition without the integration that recognition requires to become change. Those patterns were not character flaws in the simple sense. They were responses. Responses to a specific history that is not ours to fully narrate because it belongs to her. Responses to a specific relational architecture that this series has documented in its public dimensions without being able to access the interior ones. Responses to a decade of being watched in a way that rewarded the performed version of her needs over the real ones that made visibility into the currency she was paid in for exposure that extracted a different cost entirely. The patterns are changing. Not because a series documented them, not because the clinical assessment named them, because she decided they needed to change, and she built, over the past 18 months, the specific conditions under which change is possible. Honest relationships, honest work, the manuscript that names Chapter 7, the daughter conversations that the private account documents without filters, the alliance with a former adversary built on the explicit acknowledgement of the history between them rather than the erasure of it. She built the conditions for change. That is harder than the change itself. And she did it in the period that the coverage was calling the final collapse. The daughters. This is the part of the story that deserves the most care and receives the least from the coverage this space tends to produce because it is private, because it should be private, and because it is also the most consequential dimension of everything that has happened in the last 2 years of her documented life. The changes that this series has cataloged are the financial restructuring, the professional repositioning, the relationship renegotiation, the movement from managed truth toward something more genuinely honest. Those changes have a specific and non-performed motivation. It is not the brand. It is not the comeback narrative. It is not the algorithm or the journalism or any of the external pressures that the coverage tends to treat as the primary drivers of a public figure's choices. She has daughters who are becoming adults in the specific cultural moment that produced her fame. Who can search for her name? Who can find 40 episodes of this series and every other series that has covered her decade in public life? Who are at the age where the relationship between a parent's public image and a child's private understanding of who that parent actually is becomes one of the central negotiations of their emotional development? The person she is becoming less managed, more honest, more fully herself in the public dimensions of her life is being built, at least in part, for that audience of two. and an audience of 2 who know the real version is more important than any metric this channel has ever tracked. Here is what 40 episodes of the most comprehensive documentation this channel has produced on a single subject actually concludes. Not about Darcey Silva specifically, about the things she represents, which is bigger than her, and which is why she has held the world's attention for 10 years, even through every development that should have ended the attention. People are not their patterns. They are not their crises. They are not their debt filings, or their deleted posts, or their hot mic moments, or their scoring documents, or their clinical assessments, or their production insider testimonies. They are not the worst chapter of their documented life, or the most viral moment of their public existence, or the most liked comment about what they are. Every format that has ever covered Darcey Silva TLC, the commentary space, this channel, the journalism has operated on a model that treats the coverage as the person, the edit as the identity, the pattern as the totality. And that model is wrong. Not slightly wrong. Fundamentally, consequentially, irreversibly wrong. The coverage is the shadow. The person is what casts it. Shadows tell you something real and important about the shape of what casts them. They do not tell you the color. They do not tell you what the interior looks like. They do not tell you what a person is like in a room where nobody is watching, in a conversation where nobody is taking notes, in a moment where the performance layer is completely absent because there is no audience to perform for. That room, the room without an audience, is where Darcey Silva actually lives, where she has always lived, where the private account has been documenting the version the public one managed, where the sister conversation reached the thing that the mythology was always covering, where the daughters know the person rather than the symbol, where the journalist who got 3 actual days found the subject the previous decade of coverage had been circling without landing. This series got close, closer than most. Closer than anything in this specific commentary space, with 40 episodes of assembled evidence and multiple direct and indirect sources, and the most complete documentation available from the outside of a life that is ultimately not public, not ours, not reducible to its documented dimensions. We got close, and in this final episode, we are acknowledging what close means. Close means you can see the shape. Close means you understand the pattern and the history and the professional arc and the relational architecture and the clinical dimensions and the financial reality and the specific nature of the changes underway. Close means 40 episodes of the most honest work this channel can do. Close is not there. There, the actual interior, the actual person, the full human being in her complete and irreducible specificity is hers. It belongs to her entirely. As it should. As it has always been true of every person ever covered by any format ever built to make other people's lives into content. The most important thing this series has produced, more important than any specific episode, any specific revelation, any specific document or recording or sourced account, is the understanding that the subject of the coverage is always more than the coverage, that the person always exceeds the container, that the story being told is always a selection from a complete human life, and the selection is always smaller than what it is selecting from. Darcey Silva has more than 40 episodes. She is more than 10 years old. She is more than the 90-day universe that delivered her to the world and the commentary universe that built a second industry on her story. She is a specific, singular, privately intelligent, emotionally generous, pattern-complicated, genuinely changing human being. She is a mother making changes she cannot announce for an audience she cannot disappoint. She is a sister renegotiating a relationship on terms that the brand never allowed. She is a writer putting the real version in permanent record in a manuscript that names the people it should name. She is a professional rebuilding on a foundation that was always going to be more durable than the one the peak era ran on. She is a person who read the clinical assessment and the scoring document and the 40 episodes of careful documentation of her most difficult chapters and decided at significant cost, with full awareness, without the protection of the performance layer to keep going. That is not desperation. That is not a delusion. That is not the behavior of someone who does not understand what is happening to them. That is the behavior of someone who understands exactly what is happening and has decided, with the specific courage of a person who has survived everything that was done to them and everything they did to themselves, that becoming real is worth the cost of becoming visible in a different way. This series ran 40 episodes because she gave us 40 episodes of a person exceeding expectations, including, in the end, her own. The next chapter of a person genuinely becoming themselves is the most interesting content that exists. Not the most viral, not the most shareable, the most interesting, the most worth paying attention to, the most likely to contain the kind of turns that reality television promises, and almost never delivers the turn that is not manufactured for an episode arc, but is real, happening in actual time, in actual rooms, with actual consequences for an actual life. We will be here for it, with the same honesty and accountability and specific gratitude for an audience that has been, across 40 episodes, the most thoughtful community this channel has ever addressed. You watched carefully. You asked hard questions in the comment sections. You pushed back when the analysis was incomplete and affirmed when it earned affirmation. You were, across 40 episodes, exactly the audience that this subject deserved and that this channel needed. Thank you for watching. All 40, every single one of them mattered. And the next one, whenever it arrives, about whoever earns 40 episodes of this kind of attention, will be built on everything this series taught us about how to tell a story about a person honestly, with documentation, with accountability, with compassion, and with the permanent acknowledgement that the story is never the person. The person is always elsewhere, becoming, still becoming, as we all are.